aka Mr. Fantastic, and right now I'm at work. It's been a pretty slow morning so far, but I've been slowly working on expanding my style and repertoire in photography lately. I recently got really into night photography. Night photography is one area that I can't say I spent too much time in as a creator. Definitely not anything I specialized in before, but I've recently gotten really into it. The rules are totally different, so I guess in this video we're going to talk about how I have recently introduced myself to night photography. I've gotten quite into portrait photography and drone photography, and I've been making that a side hustle for myself, as well as a method to expand portfolios for myself and John and for Fantastic Productions. But night photography is one that I was always interested in, but wasn't really sure how to approach, so I did a good amount of research and just try to put my logic towards it and try to feel everything out. So last night I went ahead and went downtown because I wanted to primarily focus in urban style night photography, because the other side of the spectrum of night photography typically is astrophotography. I don't necessarily live in an area where there's very low light pollution. There are areas that I have been to that I want to go to again for the opportunity to do astrophotography, long exposures and so forth, and maybe go to more colder northern places to capture northern lights. That'd be really cool, but that's an idea for the future. The other side that's very common in night photography is doing urban photography and taking photos of buildings and cars, or using city lights as a way to light a subject. There's a lot of creative ways to go about it, but for the sake of this, and for introducing myself to night photography, I focused in urban photography, and the big thing I really wanted to focus on was trying to get different ways to creatively capture the skyline, the cityscape. I'll get into how we do all of that, just some quick basics on night photography that I picked up, and I'll recommend a few videos in the description.
All right, now that's more of our regular space, or regular studio space, talking space. So I'm gonna go over really quick the way that I do my night photography, and a few tips as to how you can possibly improve your night photography if that's something you want to do. So first, what you're gonna need a camera, preferably a DSLR, just because you can adjust your shutter speed on that. You're gonna need it so that way you can take long exposure shots, so that way you can get a lot of light into your image without getting too much noise or grain by having your ISO all the way up. And with that being said, if we're doing long exposure shots and dealing with shots that are going to have very slow shutter speed, you're going to need a tripod or some way that you can have your camera on a locked and stable position so you can get a nice stable image. Also, to make sure that your image is perfectly stable as it's being taken, you're gonna want a remote. Now you can get these kind of remotes really cheap, just a couple bucks on Amazon. I'll link a few options in the description, as well as there are a few other higher end options that will give you more ways to implement the remote into your shooting, like for time lapses, but that's a different topic. Right now we're focusing on night photography. But you're going to need a remote if you're going to be taking long exposure shots, and I would just use it entirely whenever you're shooting in really low shutter speeds, just to avoid any possible motion blur from the camera shaking from you touching it. You do not want to be touching that camera while it's on that tripod or whatever you have it on. There's a reason why you have it on there, is so it's locked and so the image is perfectly stable, unless you're going for some chaotic motion blurry image. It's your art, do what you want with it. But if you're going for something where you're going to be capturing an object like a building or something that's perfectly stable, and then capturing things that are moving around it, like cars or moving water or stars, you're going to want that camera completely still. So use a remote. Now, so I focus in two specific areas when I do my night photography. Is that I'm always either capturing a wide landscape, like a cityscape, night skyline, like the one we have here in downtown Tampa that I've been shooting recently. Or maybe you're in a very low light pollution environment where you want to capture some actual photography, or maybe you're in the Arctic Circle and you want to capture the Aurora Borealis. Basically, you're either capturing a very wide landscape and you want to capture a lot of the nuances of the light of your low light subject, or you're focusing on a specific subject with a lot going on in the background. For example, with this urban photography, you know, a lot of times that I'm shooting at night and I want to focus on an object or a model of some kind, I will have a building or like a marquee or the entire skyline in the background to get some nice light going on behind that subject and create a really nice colorful bokeh. Those are the two things I focus on in my night photography. There are a lot of other ways you can go about your shooting at night, depending on where you are and what you want to capture, but those are the two that we're focusing on for this video because that's kind of my speed. So by doing that, as I was saying before, we're going to be shooting at a very low shutter speed for most of our shots here, as well as a very wide aperture. Now this is all to make sure that we're getting a good amount of light in. You're going to be in a very dark environment, so you want to make the most out of the light that you have, whether it be in your surroundings. You definitely want to make the most out of the light in your surroundings, considering that you're capturing your setting. But at times you may also need to use lights or flashes in order to light your subject if you are shooting a subject rather than a landscape. But in all these scenarios, you're going to be shooting in a dark environment and you don't want to have your ISO super high to where you end up with a really noisy, grainy photo that you have to spend a lot of time in post fixing. I mean, you can fix it in post, and even then it's not as great. You're really better off avoiding that entirely, and you can get a much better image by getting more light through your shutter and your aperture in the first place. Now, if you're shooting a subject, you're definitely going to want your aperture wide open, so you can get that really nice colorful bokeh, at times an anamorphic bokeh, depending on what kind of lens you're shooting with. One of my favorite lenses that I'm shooting on this camera right now that I use all the time is a vintage lens, the Helios 44-2. It's become pretty popular lately in terms of vintage glass. I first had my idea of getting that one from Marquez Brownlee. He's a big fan of that lens. He's recommended it in one of his earlier studio or gear videos that he did. But anyway, this lens has a great bokeh. It's a prime lens at 58 millimeters and has a very wide aperture all the way down to f2. Now, most kit lenses that you'll get with various Canon and Nikon cameras, like an 1855 is very common. That's the lens that came with my Canon SL2. That only has an f-stop of, I want to say, about 4, which isn't bad. You can still get a pretty good colorful bokeh with that lens. But typically, if you're going to be shooting a subject at night, and you really want to make sure you get a really wide aperture, so you're letting a lot of light in and getting a nice colorful bokeh that'll really complement your subject, whether you're shooting astral or if you're shooting in an urban environment. You really want to get that really nice circular bokeh of all the different lights in the background, cars passing by. The only way you're going to achieve that is by having your aperture really as wide as possible. That way you can let more light in while keeping your ISO down, and on top of that, keeping your shutter speed really slow to make sure that for the same purpose, letting more light in without getting too much noise or grain, which is why you're going to need that tripod and that remote so you don't get any unnecessary motion blur. Now, that can be more difficult if you're ever shooting a model. It can be really difficult for your model to hold totally still and avoid any moving around, shaking, motion blur from having your shutter speed super low. So at times when you're shooting a subject, you want to have some additional form of light, a key light or a flash. Now, you could always use the built-in flash in a lot of DSLRs, but I'd recommend you at least get just like a cheap slave flash These things you can get for just a couple bucks. There are a few other ones that are much more higher end that'll last a lot longer, but these ones, if you just need a quick fix, you're on a budget, these run on AA batteries. You just throw it on there, turn it on, and you'll get a much better flash than the one that's built into your camera. Or just have some sort of key light. I often just use the flashlight on my phone, on my cell phone. It's worked great. I just need to make sure that I have enough distance of the light from my subject, or the right angle to make sure the light isn't too harsh on them. Or I'll diffuse the light with some sort of diffuser, even just like a piece of paper or wax paper, will work just fine to diffuse that light and not get such harsh shadows on your subject. That way you can get a good amount of light on your subject by just having the aperture wide open and not having the shutter going too slow. If you're shooting a subject, that way you can get the subject, perfectly focused, not too much, no motion blur, but a really nice colorful bokeh and very even lighting and colors. You'll be glad that you took these steps when you're editing this photo. Now with the landscapes, I will shoot almost all of my night landscapes as a long exposure. The way you're going to take a long exposure photo on your DSLR is by making sure it's in bulb mode. Now that'll either be a specific mode on the dial of your CellR, or you have to go into your manual settings and you'll have to turn your shutter speed all the way down until you will see it says bulb. That way you are in bulb mode. And this is when you really need your remote. What happens in bulb mode when you take a long exposure, you're keeping your shutter open for 30 seconds or more, sometimes even 30 minutes to an hour if you're capturing like star trails, or you're in a really, really low light pollution area and you want to get a lot of light into your sensor to get a really nice night landscape photo of some kind. Typically astral photography, you have to have really long exposures, but if you're doing urban, like if you want to capture light trails in traffic, or just get a really nice landscape of a skyline, you really only need to have that shutter open for 30 seconds to a minute. Otherwise it would actually get overexposed. That being said, in order to avoid overexposure, keep in mind that shutter is open for a long time. You're going to want the ISO all the way down. You're going to want your aperture closed as tightly as possible. You're going to want your settings. It's going to be very dark at first when you prep your shot. So have your regular settings just to get the framing of your shot first, then turn everything all the way down. Make sure you're in bulb, and make sure that your remote has the ability to just hold. So yeah, that way you don't have to hold your finger on that button. You're not holding your finger on the shutter button of the camera. You're just letting the camera sit and do its thing and capture your image. That's pretty much all there is to it. So just a really quick review. I'm trying to keep this video as short and concise as possible. Gear, you're going to want a tripod or some way to lock off your camera. You're going to need a camera, preferably a DSLR. That way you can vary the shutter speed. You can slow it down as much as possible to get long exposures and get possibly wanted motion blurs, like from star trails or from light trails of cars, moving water. You're going to want a remote. That way you don't have to touch the camera. You can leave it locked off so you don't get any unwanted motion blur. If you're shooting a subject, you're gonna want some extra key light or light source or a flash to make sure that your subject or model is properly lit without having your ISO all the way up, and making sure that the background doesn't overwhelm them. You're just getting a nice colorful bokeh to complement your subject. You're going to want to make sure that you're getting most of the light into your image through the shutter or the aperture. If you're shooting a subject, you're going to want more going through the aperture. If you're shooting a landscape, you're going to want to do a long exposure, have that aperture and ISO all the way down, and just let that shutter open and let the camera sit for at least 30 seconds, depending on what you're trying to capture and what the lighting is there. Take your time, give it a few tries until you get that image that you feel is perfectly level with its lighting and colors, so that way you have a really nice image later when you go to edit it in Lightroom or whatever software you use. That should be everything. So hopefully that covers everything, or at least it gives you a really good introduction to night photography. I'm still pretty new to it. It's just something I really got into, and I just really want to talk about it because I'm so excited about exposing myself to new areas of this craft. I hope that you guys are as excited as I am. So, get out there, do some night photography. Let me know in the comments how, this was for you. If you have any questions about editing or any other questions about night photography, I'm still learning, but I definitely have some knowledge to offer, hence why I'm making these videos in the first place. But I'm gonna quit rambling, get out there and shoot. Be sure to check out our links in the description for various products that'll help you out, or just, our social media platforms. And have a fantastic day.